AOC just picked a fight with the wrong guy. She walks into a congressional hearing, sees Dan Bongino at the witness table, and thinks she can destroy him like she's destroyed every other critic. Calls him a fascist former cop on live television. Demands he be silenced. The media eats it up. Her fans cheer. She's trending on Twitter within minutes. Then Bongino reaches down and pulls out the folder, 3 inches thick, 6 months of investigation. Every receipt, every FEC violation, every ethics complaint, every shell company transaction. All documented with the same forensic techniques he used hunting financial criminals in the Secret Service. And he unleashes. Smash that like button, because what happens next is the single most brutal political destruction ever captured on camera. This isn't a debate. This is a federal agent presenting a criminal case against a sitting member of Congress using official government documents. She can't deny, can't spin, can't escape from. AOC tried to silence him with identity politics. Instead, she just gave him the microphone to expose everything: the $40,000 in illegal Met Gala gifts, the $885,000 laundered through shell companies, the boyfriend, payments, the luxury lifestyle, all of it. This is 12 years of Secret Service training versus a bartender who thinks Twitter followers make her bulletproof. Spoiler alert, they don't. Not when the evidence is this damning. It was a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., but what happened in the Rayburn House office building would change American politics forever. The House Judiciary Committee had convened for what was supposed to be a routine hearing on law enforcement accountability and community safety, but it would become one of the most watched congressional hearings in American history. The committee room was packed. Every seat filled with journalists, activists, congressional staffers, C-SPAN cameras positioned strategically throughout the chamber, cable news networks broadcasting live. The air carried that electric tension that precedes significant political theater. Dan Bongino sat at the witness table with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. Former NYPD officer, 12 years in the Secret Service, protecting presidents. This was not a man who could be intimidated by political theater. He wore a dark suit, American flag pin on his lapel, reading glasses perched on the documents before him. He'd been invited to testify about law enforcement reform given his extensive federal law enforcement background. Chairman Jim Jordan gavelled the hearing to order at 10:03 a.m. The Republican from Ohio surveyed the room, his wrestler's build evident even while seated, tie slightly loosened in his characteristic style. "The committee will come to order," Jordan announced. "We're here today to discuss law enforcement accountability and community safety. Our first witness is Mr. Daniel Bongino, former Secret Service special agent and NYPD officer. Mr. Bongino, you're recognized for your opening statement." Bongino leaned toward the microphone, his distinctive New York accent carrying clearly through the room. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today. My testimony draws on 12 years of federal law enforcement experience, including investigations into financial fraud and corruption that exploit our institutions." He'd spoken for maybe 90 seconds when the doors at the back of the chamber opened. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered, and the cameras immediately pivoted. She wore a burgundy blazer over a black top, gold hoop earrings catching the overhead lights. Her entrance was deliberately late, a tactic she'd perfected. The media followed her like moths to flame. She took her seat among the Democratic members, 2 chairs down from ranking member Jerry Nadler. She didn't acknowledge Bongino, instead immediately leaning to whisper to her colleague. The microphone picked up none of it, but her expression was one of barely concealed disdain. Bongino continued, "As someone who protected President Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, I saw firsthand the dedication of law enforcement professionals who, point of order, Mr. Chairman, Ocasio-Cortez's voice cut through the room like a knife. Jordan looked up, surprised. The gentle lady from New York. She leaned forward, both hands on the table before her. I question whether this witness should even be allowed to testify before this committee. The room erupted in murmurs. Bongino sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. On what grounds? Jordan asked, his tone carrying a warning edge. Mr. Bongino is a right-wing media personality who has built an entire career on conspiracy theories and attacks on progressive members of Congress. Ocasio-Cortez said, her voice rising with practiced indignation. He has no credibility on police reform or law enforcement accountability. She pointed across the room at Bongino. This man is nothing more than a fascist former cop who's made millions spreading disinformation. He's repeatedly attacked women of color in Congress. He has no business testifying before this committee on matters of police accountability. The accusation hung in the air. Republican members immediately objected, voices overlapping. Democratic members shifted uncomfortably. Ocasio-Cortez sat back, arms crossed, looking satisfied with herself. She'd done this before, seized the narrative, made herself the story, positioned herself as the victim standing up to power. The cameras zoomed in on Bongino's face, expecting anger, perhaps an explosive response. But what they captured instead was something far more dangerous. A slight smile. The kind of expression that appears when someone's opponent has just walked directly into a carefully laid trap. Dan Bongino sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. The silence in the room was complete, except for the soft whir of cameras. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried throughout the chamber with absolute authority. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he said, and the way he emphasized her title carried a note of irony. Thank you for those comments. Since you've decided to make this personal and attack my credibility on national television, let me respond directly. He reached down beside his chair and withdrew a thick folder, easily 3 inches of paper. It landed on the table before him with a thump that echoed in the silent room. Every camera in the chamber zoomed in on that folder. You called me a fascist former cop. Bongino continued, his voice taking on the methodical tone of a detective presenting evidence. Let me establish some facts about my background before we discuss your record, Congresswoman. He held up his old Secret Service credentials encased in plastic. I spent 12 years protecting President Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, with my life. I stood post outside the Oval Office. I coordinated his visits to active war zones. Does that sound like a fascist to you? The question landed like a bomb. AOC's confident expression flickered. But since you've decided to question my credibility on national television, let me ask you some questions, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. The folder opened wider, revealing hundreds of pages of documents, tabs, marking different sections, highlighter visible on many pages. Shall we discuss your expenses, your attendance at the $35,000 per ticket Met Gala, the House Ethics Committee's finding that you violated gift rules, the $885,000 that disappeared through your former chief of staff's shell companies, the FEC complaints about campaign finance violations? Each question landed with increasing force. The color began draining from Ocasio-Cortez's face. Her mouth opened as if to interrupt, but no words came out. Chairman Jordan, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding, made a decision. The chair will grant Mr. Bongino additional time to respond to the Congresswoman's charges. Mr. Bongino, please proceed. Bongino's smile widened fractionally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people deserve to hear some facts about Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's record. He extracted the first set of documents from the folder official letterhead, visible even from the gallery. Congresswoman, I've spent the last 6 months doing what I was trained to do in the Secret Service investigating financial fraud using forensic accounting techniques. And what I found is a pattern of financial irregularities, ethics violations, and systematic disregard for the rules that govern congressional conduct. AOC found her voice. These are debunked conspiracy theories. Debunked by whom? Bongino cut her off. The House Ethics Committee that found you violated gift rules. The FEC that found your campaign failed to properly disclose $1 million in expenses. These aren't theories, Congresswoman. These are official findings by bipartisan committees. He pulled out another document, holding it up so cameras could capture the official seal. But let's start with something simple. Let's start with your tax the rich dress. The room fell into absolute silence. Every eye in the chamber fixed on Dan Bongino as he arranged the documents before him with the precision of a prosecutor laying out a case. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat frozen in her seat. The confident crusader who'd entered the room, replaced by someone who suddenly understood she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Let's discuss the Met Gala, Congresswoman, Bongino said, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. And let's discuss what it reveals about your character. Dan Bongino arranged 3 documents in a row before him, each bearing official government seals. The room remained silent, all attention focused on the witness table, where a former federal agent was about to systematically dismantle a congressional career. September 13, 2020. Bongino began reading from his notes. You attended the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute Gala, the Met Gala, as a guest of Anna Wintour, editor of Vogue magazine. He looked up at Ocasio-Cortez. You wore a white Brother Vellies gown designed by Aurora James, with the words, "Tax the Rich," emblazoned across the back in red letters. You told reporters you were making a statement about inequality. Is that correct? AOC leaned toward her microphone. I was invited to represent New York. Yes or no, Congresswoman? Did you wear that dress to make a statement about inequality? Yes. And tickets to this event cost how much? AOC hesitated. I was invited as a guest. The ticket price, Congresswoman. It's public information. How much does it cost to attend the Met Gala? $35,000, she said, her voice quieter. Bongino nodded. $35,000 per person, more than many Americans make in a year. And this event was attended by, let me see. He consulted his notes. Billionaires, celebrities, fashion moguls, tech executives. The wealthiest people in America, essentially. He paused, letting that sink in. So you wore a dress that said, "Tax the Rich," to an event that costs $35,000 per person, surrounded by the very people you claim to oppose. Let's talk about that dress. He extracted a document with the House Ethics Committee seal clearly visible. On July 25, 2025, the House Committee on Ethics released a 31-page report regarding your attendance at the Met Gala. This is a bipartisan committee, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Let me read from their findings. Bongino put on his reading glasses. The committee finds that Representative Ocasio-Cortez failed to fully comply with the gift rule by impermissibly accepting a gift of free admission to the 2021 Met Gala for her partner, and by failing to pay full fair market value for some of the items worn to the event. He looked up. That's the House Ethics Committee, Congresswoman, not a right-wing conspiracy theory. Your own congressional colleagues. AOC tried to interrupt. I made efforts to comply. Let me finish, Bongino said firmly. The Ethics Committee found that you received over $3,700 in rented clothing and accessories, but paid less than $1,000. That's an impermissible gift of approximately $2,700. But it gets worse when we dig into the details. He pulled out another document, this one with detailed financial breakdowns. This dress wasn't a rental from Rent the Runway. This was a custom-designed gown created specifically for you by Aurora James. According to the Ethics Committee's investigation, the cost of materials alone was $6,279. Bongino's voice took on an edge. The true retail value of this custom-designed gown was approximately $18,837.30. A reasonable fair market value for renting it would have been $2,976.229. You know how much you initially paid, $300. Murmurs swept through the room. Republican members were shaking their heads. Even some Democrats looked uncomfortable. But here's where it gets interesting from a fraud investigation perspective. Bongino continued shifting into his investigator mode. The designer initially valued the rental at $1,300. After your campaign staffer contacted them and asked for a lower amount, it suddenly became $300. Your staffer justified this by comparing a custom-designed, one-of-a-kind gown made specifically for you to dresses available on Rent the Runway, a mass-market clothing rental service. He pulled out an email printout. The Ethics Committee's report states the comparison of a one-of-a-kind custom-made designer gown to those sold commercially and rented to numerous individuals on Rent the Runway is simply inapposite. That's fancy legal language, Congresswoman, but in the Secret Service we'd call this what it is, obtaining goods under false pretenses. You wanted the publicity of the dress without paying the actual cost. AOC's face had gone pale. She leaned to whisper urgently to the staffer beside her. Bongino wasn't finished. But the dress is only part of the story. Let's talk about your partner, Riley Roberts. He attended the gala with you, received a free ticket valued at $35,000. House rules at the time allowed free tickets to charitable events only for spouses or dependent children. Riley Roberts was your boyfriend, not your spouse. He held up the Ethics Committee report again. The committee specifically found Representative Ocasio-Cortez failed to fully comply with the gift rule by impermissibly accepting a gift of free admission to the 2021 Met Gala for her partner. That's another $35,000 in impermissible gifts. The numbers were staggering. Chairman Jordan's expression suggested he was learning some of this for the first time. Even members who had voted on various AOC-related resolutions seemed surprised by the detailed compilation. Now let's discuss the payment timeline, Bongino said, pulling out a series of invoices. This is where the pattern of behavior becomes clear. The Met Gala was September 13, 2021. But payments to vendors, the hairstylist, the makeup artist, the designer weren't made for months. He began laying out documents chronologically. Hair and makeup services not paid until the Office of Congressional Ethics started investigating. The designer's invoice not paid until March 9, 2022, 6 months later, and only after the ethics probe began. A second invoice for nearly $5,600 for additional expenses, including room rentals, car service shoes, and Roberts's bow tie, paid May 2022, again only after investigators were already involved. Bongino looked directly at AOC. In the Secret Service, when we investigated fraud, we looked for patterns. Innocent people pay their bills on time. Guilty people delay, hoping the bill disappears or gets forgotten. You accepted over $40,000 in gifts, the tickets, the custom gown, the accessories, the services. You tried to pay as little as possible, and you only paid what you were legally required to pay after investigators forced you to. AOC tried to defend herself. I wasn't personally aware of the payment delays. You blamed your staff, Bongino interrupted. I read your interview with the Office of Congressional Ethics. You said, and I quote, "I just never, ever, ever would have allowed that to happen, knowing what I have learned. But I wasn't privy to the invoices, wasn't privy to the ones that had been sent." His voice hardened. Congresswoman, you signed off on attending the gala. You wore the dress. You brought your boyfriend. You posed for pictures. You got the publicity you wanted. But you weren't privy to the invoices. In law enforcement, we call that willful blindness. He gathered the Met Gala documents into a neat pile. The House Ethics Committee ordered you to pay an additional $2,733.28 to vendors for the fair market value of accessories and to donate $250 for Riley Roberts' meal. You ultimately paid, but only because you were forced to by an ethics investigation. Bongino leaned forward. But here's what bothers me most, Congresswoman. This entire event wearing Tax the Rich to a $35,000 per ticket gala, while accepting tens of thousands in gifts from wealthy designers, it perfectly encapsulates the hypocrisy. You lecture Americans about inequality while enjoying the lifestyle of the elite you claim to oppose. He paused for effect. But the Met Gala is just the tip of the iceberg. It reveals something about your character, about how you view rules and accountability. So let's dig deeper. Let's discuss your campaign finances. Let's discuss the $885,000 that disappeared into shell companies controlled by your former chief of staff. The folder opened again, revealing another thick section of documents. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat motionless in her seat. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The room waited for what would come next. Dan Bongino pulled out a flowchart, laminated professionally made with boxes and arrows, showing the flow of money. He held it up so the cameras could capture it clearly. Congresswoman, let's talk about where your campaign money goes. Or rather, where it disappears to. He propped the chart against the documents on the table. This is a diagram of what I call the Ocasio-Cortez campaign finance shell game. It involves multiple entities, shell companies, and a maze of transactions designed to obscure how money is actually spent. He pointed to the boxes on the chart. Let's identify the players. First, we have Justice Democrats PAC. You were on the board of this PAC while you were a candidate for Congress in 2018. Second, Brand New Congress PAC. Third, Brand New Congress, LLC, a limited liability company owned by your former campaign manager and chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti. Fourth, Brand New Campaign, LLC, also owned by Chakrabarti. AOC shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ranking Member Nadler leaned over to whisper something to her, but Bongino continued before she could respond. Here's how the scheme worked during your 2018 campaign, Bongino said, using a pen to trace the arrows on his chart. Just as Democrats PAC raised millions in donations from small-dollar donors who believed they were supporting progressive candidates. Those donations were supposed to be used for campaign activities, advertising, canvassing, voter outreach. He circled the LLC boxes. But instead, large sums were transferred from the PACs to Chakrabarti's limited liability companies. According to Federal Election Commission records and a complaint filed by the National Legal and Policy Center in March 2019, approximately $885,000 was transferred this way. He pulled out a thick stack of FEC filings. The stated purpose on these transfers: strategic consulting. That's it. Just strategic consulting. No itemization, no specifics about what services were actually provided. Bongino looked up at the committee. Now, why does this matter? Payees must report their spending. They must itemize every expense over $200. They must disclose vendor names, purposes, dates, amounts. It's all public. But LLCs, he shook his head. LLCs have no such reporting requirements. Money goes in and it disappears into a black hole. Perfect for hiding how funds are actually spent. He extracted a formal complaint document. On March 4, 2019, the National Legal and Policy Center filed a complaint with the FEC. Let me read from it. Representative Ocasio-Cortez and her Chief of Staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, orchestrated an extensive off-the-books operation to make hundreds of thousands of dollars of expenditures in support of multiple candidates for federal office. Chairman Jordan leaned forward. Mr. Bongino, what were the allegations specifically? Three major allegations, Mr. Chairman, Bongino replied, counting them on his fingers. First, that Representative Ocasio-Cortez controlled Justice Democrats' PAC while simultaneously running her own campaign committee. That's potentially illegal because it allows circumventing contribution limits. If you control the PAC that's supporting you, you're essentially fundraising for yourself without the legal limits. Second, that $885,000 was routed through shell companies to avoid reporting requirements. By claiming it was all strategic consulting to an LLC, they avoided having to disclose where that money actually went and what it was actually used for. Third, that the payments were grossly excessive for the services allegedly provided. Your campaign raised $4.6 million total during 2018, Congresswoman. You paid one vendor, your campaign manager's personal LLC, $885,000. That's 19% of all money raised. To put that in perspective, most congressional campaigns pay 3 to 5% for consulting services. He pulled out another document. Former FEC Commissioner Hans von Spakovsky said, and I quote, "If the facts as alleged are true, and a candidate had control over a PAC that was working to get that candidate elected, then that candidate is potentially in very big trouble and may have engaged in multiple violations of federal campaign finance law, including receiving excessive contributions." AOC tried to interject. The FEC dismissed those complaints. Let's be precise about what happened. Bongino cut her off. In April 2022, the FEC released its findings. They found that your campaign and the PACs did not properly disclose the purpose of the disbursements to the shell companies. They confirmed reporting violations. They found you failed to disclose approximately $1 million in expenses properly. He leaned forward. But then they voted to dismiss the complaint without pursuing enforcement action. Why? Because the FEC is notoriously weak, understaffed, politically divided, and slow to act. A dismissal doesn't mean you did nothing wrong, Congresswoman. It means they chose not to prosecute. Bongino pulled out another document. Bradley Smith, another former FEC chairman, said, "I see almost no way that you can do that without it being at least a reporting violation, quite likely a violation of the contribution limits." He wasn't finished. But here's an interesting detail that got buried in the original reporting. Your boyfriend, Riley Roberts, the same Riley Roberts who got the free Met Gala ticket, brand new Congress PAC, paid him $6,000 in August and September of 2017. He held up the FEC records. Two payments, $3,000 each. The stated purpose, according to the Coolidge-Reagan Foundation complaint, vague and amorphous services. Nobody could explain what Riley Roberts actually did to earn $6,000 from a PAC supporting your campaign. AOC's face flushed. Riley provided marketing services. What marketing services? Bongino demanded. There's no documentation, no work product, no explanation in the FEC filings. The complaint noted the timing and amounts of these transactions, the use of intermediaries, the vague nature of the services. Riley ostensibly provided the magnitude compared to funds raised at that time, and the romantic relationship between Ocasio-Cortez and Riley collectively establish reason to believe these transactions may have violated campaign finance law. He set down the document. In plain English, it looks like you funneled campaign money to your boyfriend through a PAC using vague descriptions to avoid scrutiny. Bongino began stacking documents. But you didn't learn your lesson, did you, Congresswoman? Even after the complaints, the investigations, the scrutiny, your campaign continued to fail to properly report expenses. He pulled out a fresh complaint. April 2023. The Coolidge-Reagan Foundation filed another FEC complaint. This one alleged your campaign failed to properly disclose where nearly $10,000 in credit card payments actually went. Campaigns must itemize credit card charges exceeding $200, must include vendor names, addresses, purposes, dates, amounts. Your campaign just didn't. He read from the complaint. Not only is the public entitled to that information, but without such disclosure, it is impossible to confirm a candidate is not illegally using campaign funds to pay personal expenses. Bongino removed his reading glasses and looked directly at AOC. This is a pattern, Congresswoman. From 2018 to 2023, 5 years, multiple FEC complaints, multiple findings of improper disclosure, $885,000 routed through shell companies' payments to your boyfriend, failure to itemize expenses properly. He gathered all the campaign finance documents into a pile. This isn't mistakes. This isn't staff errors. This is systematic disregard for campaign finance law. It's treating transparency requirements as optional. It's treating the rules as suggestions that apply to other people, but not to you. AOC tried to respond, her voice shaking slightly. These were reviewed by counsel. Your counsel, who compared a $20,000 custom gown to Rent the Runway, Bongino shot back. Your counsel, who didn't ensure vendor payments were made on time. Your counsel, who let $885,000 flow through your campaign manager's personal LLCs without proper documentation. He leaned back. In the Secret Service, we investigated financial crimes, wire fraud, money laundering, shell company schemes. What you've done with your campaign finances shows every red flag we were trained to look for: unexplained payments to connected individuals, shell companies to obscure money flow, delayed vendor payments, failure to document purposes, excessive payments to single vendors. The FEC might not have prosecuted. The Justice Department might not have opened a criminal investigation. But that doesn't mean the evidence isn't there. It means you've been protected by your celebrity status, by your identity politics shield, by a weak FEC, and by media that doesn't want to damage a progressive star. Bongino opened yet another section of his folder. But we're not done discussing your finances, Congresswoman. Let's talk about your lifestyle. Let's discuss the democratic socialist who lives like a millionaire. The cameras had been running for over an hour. C-SPAN's viewership numbers were climbing exponentially as clips from the hearing went viral across social media in real time. In the committee room, Dan Bongino showed no signs of slowing down. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he began pulling out a new set of documents. You identify as a democratic socialist. You've advocated for wealth redistribution, said that billionaires shouldn't exist, called for massive tax increases on high earners. You've built your political brand on being a voice for the working class. So let's examine how you actually live. He spread out several pages of campaign finance reports. Your campaign spending tells an interesting story. In 2019, your campaign spent $29,365.70 on Uber Lyft and private car services. In that same period, you spent $8,335.41 on subway fares. Bongino looked up. Your campaign headquarters was located in Jackson Heights, Queens. According to Google Maps, it's a 1-minute walk to the nearest subway station. Yet your campaign spent 3.5 times more on private car services than public transportation. He pulled out another document. You've advocated loudly for the Green New Deal, calling for radical reductions in carbon emissions, promoting public transportation over private vehicles. But your own campaign spending suggests you prefer the comfort of private cars to the subway your constituents use every day. AOC tried to respond. Campaign security required, "Let's talk about your personal vehicle," Bongino interrupted. You drive a Tesla Model 3, which retails for approximately $46,000. You've justified this as an environmental necessity. But working-class New Yorkers, the people you claim to represent, they take the subway. They take the bus. They can't afford $46,000 electric cars. He set down those documents and picked up new ones. Now let's discuss your residence. You live in a luxury apartment building in Washington, D.C.'s Navy Yard neighborhood. Rent is approximately $2,800 per month, which comes to $33,600 annually. Your congressional salary is $174,000, so after rent and taxes, you're living quite comfortably. Bongino pulled out fashion magazine printouts. But what's really interesting is your wardrobe. Fashion analysts and blogs have tracked your outfits. Beyond the $18,000 Met Gala dress you regularly wear, designer clothing. A Gabriella Hearst blazer, worth $1,990. A Theory suit, worth $1,100. Gianvito Rossi shoes, worth $695. He spread the photos across the table. For a self-proclaimed woman of the people, you dress very expensively. And before you say these were gifts or borrowed for events, they appear in your casual social media posts, not just official appearances. Bongino shifted to another topic. Let's discuss your origin story because it's central to your political brand. You campaign as a girl from the Bronx, implying a working-class, struggling background. AOC, the bartender who overcame poverty to reach Congress. It's a powerful narrative. It's also misleading. He pulled out property records and school enrollment documents. You were born in the Bronx, that's true. But your family moved to Yorktown Heights in Westchester County when you were 5 years old. Let me tell you about Yorktown Heights for those unfamiliar. He read from demographic data. Median household income, $96,000, more than double the national average. Your family owned a house there. You attended good public schools. This isn't a poverty story, Congresswoman. This is a comfortable suburban middle-class upbringing. AOC's jaw tightened. My father was an architect. Exactly, Bongino said. Your father owned an architecture firm. Your mother was a cleaner, yes, but your family owned property. You had opportunities. You attended Boston University, graduated cum laude, with a double major in economics and international relations. That's not a typical bartender background. He leaned forward. I'm not criticizing your family's success. I'm criticizing how you've misrepresented your background for political gain. You present yourself as someone who struggled through poverty when the reality is you had a comfortable suburban upbringing and received a quality education. You appropriate working-class struggle for political capital while living a lifestyle most working-class Americans can't afford. Bongino pulled out more documents. Let's talk about your staff salaries because this raises questions. You announced with great fanfare that you'd pay your staff a minimum of $52,000 and a maximum of $80,000. You framed this as standing up for workers refusing to participate in the typical congressional pay hierarchy. He looked at payroll records. But here's what's interesting. Your chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, was supposedly paid only $80,000, far below the typical $126,000 or more for that position. Why does that matter? Because salaries over $126,000 require detailed financial disclosure forms that reveal other sources of income and potential conflicts of interest. Bongino held up the FEC records they'd discussed earlier. But we know Chakrabarti's LLCs received $885,000 from your campaign and associated PACs. So was he making $80,000 from congressional salary and hundreds of thousands more through his shell companies? By keeping his official salary at $80,000, you avoided requiring him to file detailed financial disclosures that might have revealed the full extent of these arrangements. He set down the documents. This is the pattern, Congresswoman. You advocate for the working class while living like the elite. You preach about inequality while wearing $2,000 designer jackets. You claim to oppose the wealthy while attending their exclusive events. You demand transparency while obscuring your own campaign finances through shell companies. Bongino's voice took on a harder edge. In the Secret Service, I protected presidents regardless of their politics. I stood in the rain, in the heat, in the cold. I risked my life, not for glory, not for publicity, but because it was the job. When I see someone who claims to serve the people while living a lifestyle of privilege, while accepting gifts from the wealthy, while routing campaign money through shell companies, it offends me. He gathered his documents. But there's one more thing we need to discuss. Because all of these issues, the Met Gala, the campaign, finances, the lifestyle, hypocrisy, they all raise the same question. How do you keep getting away with it? What protects you from accountability? Bongino's expression hardened. Let's talk about your shield, Congresswoman. Let's talk about how you use identity politics to deflect from legitimate criticism and evidence. Dan Bongino pulled out a compilation of news articles, social media posts, and video transcripts. The pile was substantial, marked with colored tabs. Congresswoman, let's discuss something that's become a pattern in your political career, how you respond to criticism and accountability. He began laying out documents chronologically. Every time someone raises questions about your conduct finances or statements you deploy, the same defensive playbook. He held up a series of tweets printed on paper. Met Gala Ethics Investigation announced, you tweeted that it was rooted in sexism and misogyny. FEC complaints about campaign finances. You called them racist attacks on women of color in Congress. Questions about your expenses. You claimed critics were threatened by a powerful young woman of color. Bongino looked directly at AOC. Notice the pattern. It's never about the evidence. It's never about the actual allegations. It's always about your identity as a woman, as Latina, as young. Anyone who criticizes you gets immediately labeled as sexist, racist, or both. He pulled out a video transcript. When the House Ethics Committee announced its investigation into the Met Gala, you said, quote, "This is what happens when you challenge power in this country. They come after women who dare to speak up." But the Ethics Committee is bipartisan. It has Democratic members. They found you violated gift rules based on evidence, not prejudice. Bongino's voice rose slightly. I spent 12 years in the Secret Service investigating actual criminals, people who defrauded investors, laundered money, exploited government programs. When we presented evidence, If they tried to deflect by calling us racist or sexist, it didn't make the evidence disappear. The facts remained facts. He gestured to all the documents spread across the table. Everything I've presented today, the House Ethics Committee report, the FEC findings, the campaign finance complaints, the payment records, these are facts. Official government documents, bipartisan committee findings, public records. Your response: to accuse me of being a fascist. AOC leaned toward her microphone. Your history of attacking progressive women. Cite one example, Bongino interrupted. One specific example where I attacked someone based on their gender or race rather than their actions or policies. Silence. You can't, Bongino continued, because it doesn't exist. What I do is investigate fraud and corruption regardless of who commits it. But you've learned that by claiming victimhood based on your identity, you can deflect scrutiny. And it's worked for years because institutions are afraid of being labeled as prejudiced. He pulled out media analysis. Let's discuss how the media treats you differently because of this shield. Mainstream media outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, they've run puff pieces about you. The freshman congresswoman challenging the establishment. How AOC became a social media superstar. Vanity Fair covers, Vogue profiles, Time magazine's Next Generation Leaders. Bongino spread out the magazine covers. But serious investigative journalism into your campaign finances, rare. Deep dives into your ethics violations, mostly from conservative outlets. Why? Because mainstream journalists don't want to be accused of attacking a progressive woman of color, so they give you a pass. He held up conservative media articles. When Fox News, Washington Examiner, or Daily Caller do investigate you, you immediately dismiss it, right-wing attacks. This allows you to ignore the evidence they present, even when it's based on official documents and public records. AOC tried again. Those outlets have an agenda, and the outlets that protect you don't, Bongino shot back. The media that published the Met Gala dress photos favorably, that amplified your tax-the-rich message that rarely questions your campaign finances, they don't have an agenda. He pulled out a statement from the squad. Let's talk about your allies. When Representative Ilhan Omar faced serious questions about immigration fraud allegations and campaign finance violations, you defended her. When you face investigations, she defends you. Representatives Tlaib and Presley do the same. You've created a protective alliance where you deflect criticism of each other by claiming it's all rooted in prejudice. Bongino leaned forward. But here's what's changed. Americans are getting tired of this playbook. They're tired of watching politicians hide behind identity while evidence of misconduct piles up. They're tired of being called bigots for asking legitimate questions about financial transparency. He gestured to all the documents. I've presented official government findings today. House Ethics Committee, bipartisan, FEC records public documents, campaign finance complaints filed by watchdog groups. None of this is from anonymous sources or partisan speculation. These are facts. Your defense has been to call me a fascist, to imply criticism is rooted in prejudice, to blame your staff for the problems. But you've never actually addressed the evidence. You've never explained why you accepted $40,000 in gifts at the Met Gala. You've never explained why $885,000 went through your campaign manager's shell companies. You've never explained the pattern of failing to properly report campaign expenses. Bongino gathered the documents. In the Secret Service, we called this deflection behavior. When guilty parties are confronted with evidence, They attack the investigator rather than addressing the evidence. They claim victimhood. They appeal to sympathy. What they don't do is provide counter-evidence or legitimate explanations. He looked at the committee. For years, Representative Ocasio-Cortez has been protected by a combination of media favoritism, political alliance with the squad, and the ability to claim that any criticism is rooted in prejudice. But that protection has a limit. When official government committees find violations, when public records show patterns of financial irregularity, when the evidence is overwhelming, the shield doesn't work anymore. Bongino stood gathering his materials. It's time for accountability. Real accountability based on evidence, not narrative. Based on facts, not identity politics. Dan Bongino remained standing, surveying the committee room. Over 2 hours had passed since the hearing began. What was supposed to be routine testimony on law enforcement accountability had become the most comprehensive public exposure of a congressional member's financial conduct in recent memory. Let me summarize what we've documented here today. Bongino said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent a career building cases against criminals. Using the same forensic accounting and investigative techniques I learned in the Secret Service, I've compiled evidence of a pattern of behavior that should concern every American. He counted on his fingers. 1 Met Gala attendance. You accepted over $40,000 in impermissible gifts, custom dress, valued at nearly $19,000 accessories services, and a ticket for your partner. You paid a fraction of the fair market value delayed vendor payments for months, and only paid what you legally owed after investigators forced you to. The House Ethics Committee confirmed this violation. 2 campaign finance irregularities, $885,000 from your campaign, and associated PACs routed through shell companies owned by your campaign manager, avoiding transparency requirements. The FEC found you failed to properly disclose approximately $1 million in campaign expenses. Multiple complaints filed, multiple findings of reporting violations. 3 payments to connected individuals. Your boyfriend received $6,000 from a PAC supporting your campaign for services that were never adequately documented. Your chief of staff's companies received nearly $900,000 while he was paid a below-market congressional salary that avoided triggering financial disclosure requirements. 4 Lifestyle hypocrisy. You advocate for democratic socialism and wealth redistribution while living a life of relative luxury, designer clothes, expensive car, luxury apartment preference for private car services over public transportation, despite advocating for the Green New Deal. By misrepresentation of background. You campaign as a working-class kid from the Bronx, when the reality is a comfortable suburban upbringing in Westchester County with educational advantages most Americans don't have. 6 Identity politics shield. Every time evidence of misconduct emerges, you deflect by claiming criticism is rooted in sexism or racism, rather than addressing the actual evidence. Bongino's voice hardened. This isn't about mistakes, Congresswoman. This is about a pattern of behavior that shows systematic disregard for the rules that govern congressional conduct and campaign finance. It's about someone who presents themselves as a champion of the people while acting like rules don't apply to them. He looked directly at AOC. You called me a fascist former cop. You tried to question my credibility to deflect attention from your own conduct. But I'm not the one under ethics investigation. I'm not the one who violated gift rules. I'm not the one who routed campaign money through shell companies. I'm not the one who failed to pay vendors until investigators forced me to. I spent 12 years in the Secret Service. I protected President Barack Obama with my life. I investigated financial fraud and corruption. I know what misconduct looks like. And what I see here is someone who's been protected by celebrity status, by identity politics, by media favoritism, and by political alliances, but who has repeatedly violated the rules while claiming to represent the people. Bongino turned to Chairman Jordan. Mr. Chairman, based on the evidence I've compiled, I'm making several formal recommendations to this committee. First, I recommend a comprehensive House Ethics Committee investigation into all campaign finance activities, not just the Met Gala incident. Full review of the $885,000 in payments to shell companies and all related transactions. Second, I recommend the House refer this matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation into potential campaign finance violations, including the possible knowing and willful failure to properly report campaign expenses. Third, I recommend the Federal Election Commission reopen its investigation into the 2018 campaign finance complaints with additional scrutiny and resources. Fourth, I recommend the IRS investigate potential tax violations related to campaign funds used for personal benefit. Fifth, I recommend this committee issue a subpoena for complete financial records from all LLCs that received payments from Representative Ocasio-Cortez's campaign or associated PACs to determine exactly where that $885,000 went. Hugh Jordan nodded slowly. The committee will take your recommendations under advisement. Bongino looked back at AOC. Congresswoman, you have the opportunity right now to provide evidence to refute what I've presented. You could release all campaign finance records voluntarily. You could provide documentation of what your boyfriend did to earn $6,000 from the PAC. You could explain exactly what services Chakrabarty's LLCs provided to justify $885,000 in payments. You could address the evidence rather than attacking the investigator. The room fell silent. Every camera in the chamber focused on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her face had gone through various shades of emotion during Bongino's testimony: confidence, anger, shock, defensiveness. Now she looked pale, her jaw tight. She leaned toward her microphone. These are false smears designed to silence a woman of color in Congress who— Evidence, Bongino interrupted. Address the evidence. The House Ethics Committee. Report, is it false? The FEC findings, are they false? The public records, are they fabricated? If I've lied about anything, cite the specific falsehood and provide counter-evidence. AOC's voice shook slightly. I've been investigated multiple times and cleared. You were found in violation of gift rules by the Ethics Committee. That's not being cleared. The FEC found reporting violations. That's not being cleared. You paid fines. You were ordered to make additional payments. That's not being cleared. That's being caught and forced to pay what you owed. Bongino gathered his folders. Congresswoman in the Secret Service, I saw real fascism when I investigated foreign criminal organizations and terrorist threats. Calling someone a fascist because they presented evidence of your misconduct isn't just wrong, it's an insult to people who've actually suffered under fascist regimes. He looked around the committee room. What I've done today isn't fascism. It's accountability, something you've avoided for too long because people were afraid to challenge you. But I'm not afraid, because I have evidence, official evidence, government documents, public records, facts. And facts don't care about identity politics. Facts don't care about media narratives. Facts don't care about how many Twitter followers you have. Facts are facts. Bongino sat back down, placing his hands flat on the table before him. I've said what I came to say. The evidence is public now. Americans can judge for themselves whether this is the kind of representation they want in Congress. Chairman Jordan looked at AOC. Congresswoman, you'll have the opportunity for questions and rebuttal. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat silent, looking down at the table before her. The confident crusader who'd entered the hearing room to attack Bongino's credibility was gone, replaced by someone who appeared to finally understand the magnitude of what had just happened. The cameras captured it all. Within minutes, clips were spreading across social media. Within an hour, it would be the top story on every news website. Within 24 hours, it would be viewed over 100 million times. The protection was gone. The evidence was public. Accountability had arrived. 3 months after Dan Bongino's testimony, the political landscape had shifted in ways few could have predicted. The hearing, which had been viewed over 250 million times across all platforms, had fundamentally altered how Americans viewed both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the broader issue of congressional accountability. The Rayburn Building hearing room had been the site of countless congressional testimonies over the decades, but veteran Capitol Hill reporters agreed they'd never seen anything quite like the Bongino AOC confrontation. The combination of detailed documentary evidence, forceful presentation, and the stunning reversal of a confrontation AOC had initiated made it unlike typical he said, she said political theater. Within 48 hours of the hearing, mainstream media outlets that had largely ignored or downplayed previous AOC controversies found themselves unable to avoid the story. The evidence Bongino presented wasn't from anonymous sources or partisan speculation. It came from official government committees, public FEC records, and bipartisan investigations. The Washington Post ran a lengthy piece titled, "Questions Mount about Representative Ocasio-Cortez's Financial Practices." The New York Times, which had previously published generally favorable coverage of AOC, ran an article examining a pattern of campaign finance irregularities. Even CNN, which had often featured AOC as a progressive voice, ran segments with legal analysts discussing the seriousness of the House Ethics Committee findings. But perhaps more significant than media coverage was the institutional response. The House Ethics Committee, which had previously closed the Met Gala matter after AOC made additional payments, announced it would conduct a comprehensive review of all her campaign finance activities. The vote to expand the investigation was bipartisan, 10-0. In light of additional information brought to the committee's attention, Chairman Michael Guest said in a statement, "We believe a more thorough examination of campaign finance practices is warranted." The Federal Election Commission, typically slow to act, announced it was reopening its review of the 2018 campaign finance complaints. While the FEC stopped short of announcing a formal investigation, the statement suggested they would apply additional scrutiny to matters they had previously dismissed. More ominously for AOC, the Department of Justice confirmed it had received criminal referrals from multiple congressional Republicans regarding potential campaign finance violations. While DOJ wouldn't comment on whether they were opening an investigation, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, with jurisdiction over New York, congressional campaigns were reportedly reviewing the matter. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division, which handles potential tax fraud cases, was also reportedly examining whether campaign funds had been improperly used for personal benefit, which could constitute taxable income that wasn't reported. But beyond institutional responses, the political damage was severe and immediate. Within a week of the hearing, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's approval rating in her district dropped from 62% to 48%, the first time she'd been underwater since her initial election in 2018. Among voters who identified as progressive, her approval dropped from 78% to 61%. Campaign fundraising told an even more dramatic story. In the quarter following the hearing, AOC's campaign raised $2.1 million, a 67% drop from the previous quarter. Small dollar donations, which had been her strength, fell even more dramatically, down 74%. Several major progressive donors quietly withdrew support, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Primary challengers began emerging almost immediately. Don Samuels, who had nearly defeated AOC in the 2022 primary, despite being vastly outspent, announced he would run again. This time, however, he raised $500,000 in the first 2 weeks after announcing nearly as much as he'd raised in the entire 2022 race. Other challengers entered as well, all running on themes of ethics and accountability. The Squad AOC's alliance of progressive congresswomen showed visible strain. When reporters asked Representatives Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley to comment on the Bongino hearing, their responses were notably tepid. Omar tweeted vague support, but didn't address any specific evidence. Tlaib and Pressley said nothing publicly. The coordinated defense that had protected Squad members in previous controversies was conspicuously absent. Democratic leadership sent perhaps the most telling signal. Speaker Pelosi's office released a brief statement. The House Ethics Committee will conduct its review according to established procedures. We believe in due process for all members. Translation: AOC was on her own. For Dan Bongino, the aftermath transformed him from prominent conservative commentator to something larger. His podcast downloads increased 600% in the week following the hearing. The Dan Bongino Show temporarily became the one podcast in America across all categories. His publisher announced a new book deal for an exposé on congressional corruption with a 7-figure advance. But more than personal success, Bongino had sparked a broader movement. Within days of his testimony, conservative activists and watchdog groups began compiling similar evidence files on other progressive members of Congress. The model he'd demonstrated detailed forensic analysis of public records, presentation of official findings, rather than speculation, focus on documented evidence, rather than political attacks, became a template. The Bongino Standard, as some commentators called it, represented a new approach to holding politicians accountable. Rather than partisan attacks that could be easily dismissed, it focused on official government findings, public records, and documented patterns of behavior. 3 months after the hearing, other investigations were already underway. Representative Ilhan Omar, who had been one of AOC's strongest defenders, found herself facing renewed scrutiny of old allegations as activists applied Bongino's methodology to compile evidence. Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Jamal Bowman faced similar treatment. But the Bongino approach wasn't limited to progressive Democrats. Conservative activists also began investigating Republican members applying the same forensic analysis to their campaign finances and ethics compliance. Several Republican representatives found themselves under new scrutiny for potential violations that had previously gone unexamined. In that sense, the Bongino AOC hearing had achieved something rare in polarized American politics. It had created a new standard for accountability that applied regardless of party or ideology. If you were in Congress, if you had violated ethics rules or campaign finance laws, if you had patterns of financial irregularity, detailed evidence could be compiled and you could be held accountable. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, specifically, the 3 months after the hearing were among the most difficult of her political career. She largely avoided media appearances, limiting herself to written statements and carefully curated social media posts. The confident, combative persona that had made her a progressive star was replaced by someone who appeared chastened and defensive. She hired new legal counsel white shoe law firms with expertise in congressional ethics and campaign finance law. She replaced her chief of staff. She began a thorough review of all campaign finances with the stated goal of ensuring full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. But the damage to her political brand was severe. The narrative that had propelled her to national prominence, AOC, the authentic voice of the working class, the challenger of the establishment, the fearless progressive, had been replaced by a more complicated and less flattering story. AOC, the politician who lived like the elite she criticized, who violated ethics rules while claiming to challenge power, who used identity politics to shield herself from accountability. Whether she could rebuild that brand, whether she could survive primary challenges, whether she could regain the trust of supporters who felt betrayed by the revelations. These questions remained unanswered as the epilogue to the Bongino hearing continued to unfold. But one thing was certain: American politics had changed. The era when celebrity status, identity politics, or media protection could shield politicians from accountability based on documented evidence was ending. A former Secret Service agent with a folder full of official government documents had proven that evidence could defeat narrative, that facts could overcome deflection, that accountability was still possible in American democracy. And somewhere in a studio, Dan Bongino was already preparing his next investigation, his next folder, his next exposure of political corruption, because the work, as he said, was never done. Smash that like button if you believe in accountability over identity, politics. Subscribe, because this is just the beginning. We're going after corruption on both sides of the aisle. Share this everywhere, because the establishment media doesn't want you to see how easily their protected politicians fall when confronted with evidence. Comment below which politician should be investigated next. The folders are ready. The evidence is being compiled and accountability is coming for everyone who thought they were above the law. This is what happens when someone has the courage to present facts instead of partisan attacks. This is what happens when evidence defeats narrative. This is what happens when Americans demand accountability from their representatives, regardless of party identity or media protection. God bless the investigators who care about truth more than popularity. God bless the citizens demanding transparency. God bless everyone who still believes that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. The Bongino AOC hearing proved it can be done. Evidence can defeat protection. Facts can overcome deflection. Truth, when presented with courage and documentation, will always prevail in the end. The swamp is deep, but it's not impossible to drain when the right person has access to the evidence and the courage to present it.